There we go. Well, thanks to everyone for being here on this Friday morning. You may have noticed we have a special guest in our classroom today, Dr. Bush, that many of you know. He is sitting in to kind of conduct a peer, what's called a peer teaching observation record. What does the R stand for?
I think so. I think you're right.
Yeah, let's go with that. To basically like sit in on a class and give me some feedback on how things are going and talk about generally about how class is structured and all that good stuff. So you see him there, he's in Matt's spot for today. We are going to continue with the nervous system today. Before we do, just a couple quick announcements. A reminder that the final speaker in our biology seminar series is coming this Tuesday. OWU alum from Kenyon College's Philander Chase Conservancy. I'm looking forward to seeing her here. It's Tuesday in the afternoon. Please come and tell your friends about it. Also, another announcement, you probably saw this in your other classes, but I'm actually recruiting students to do research in my lab for credit and or pay, well, not and, credit or pay in the spring semester, next summer and beyond. There's a position posting in Handshake. You guys see me 4 days a week, so let me know if you have questions or you're interested, or if you know someone who might be interested, please pass along the word. On to human anatomy. We have a fun warm-up activity to get us started today. We have kind of a lengthy agenda today, but everything is kind of short. Then we'll continue with the nervous system. I'm going to take a little break midway through class and show you a fascinating video that illustrates how our nervous system is an a system of electrical conductances, and you'll see a cool demonstration of that. Then we'll get to more of the nervous system. If we have time at the end of the class, I have a human anatomy in the news about brain cells that continue working after you're dead, which is kind of interesting. Maybe I should save that one for Halloween. And finally, just some scheduling updates and reminders, a wrap up and a ticket out at the end. And of course, it's Friday, so you get your Friday Venn diagram. I had to do a bit of digging for this week's Venn diagram. As we work through, don't forget you have a study guide. Again, this is a set of Google Slides that you can save and make your own and make notes on. I won't collect it or ever look at it. The idea is just to provide you with some resources and diagrams as we work through this material. Before we dive in, what questions do you have? All right, so first activity, let's get back thinking about what we covered on Wednesday, and that was the 4 general divisions of the nervous system. We have the somatic sensory, the visceral sensory, the somatic motor, and the visceral motor. So what I'm going to do in a second here is put up a chart that has all of your names and then has an activity. And your job is to take a minute or so and think about, for that activity, which of these 4 categories of your nervous system does it best fit with. Then we'll talk amongst each other for a minute, and then we'll bring it back to the full class to give some examples. So here's the list. Go ahead, find your name and see what activity you have and decide which of these 4 categories it best fits with. I'll go around and check in and answer any questions. And Zoe, I got your quiz to give back to you. That's okay. I'm glad you're here. It's the second car battery this week in class that's died. Yeah. Watch your car batteries, people. Everyone look there, take a look. I can answer any questions. I don't have a timer up, but let's just take about a minute to decide where you need. What do you got? Ooh. What do you got? Marge, you trying to use this? Oh, let me give you that. That's all the field sensor experience count, but you had to pick one before. Look back in your notes. You have a special. All right. Sounds like you guys have a good rest. Go ahead, turn to your neighbor and tell them what your activity is and what you think where it fits, and then go ahead and swap, and we'll bring it back together for a full group. This was mine. Reading Braille. I out of those two.
Yeah, I need to, I haven't done the notes yet, I need to put notes. And then that's not. I got time in the rest.
All right, everyone I've checked in with sounds like they have a really good grasp on this. Does anyone want to share theirs with the class and just talk briefly about what it is? Gia, yeah, and that's perfect that you put your hand up. I love it. Okay. Good. Good. Remember, motor is information traveling from the central nervous system, generally the brain, to organs that are affected. So skeletal muscle in this case. Good. Continue. Yep, that body sense is part of the somatic sensory system. Yep. One little thing, just be careful about the term special senses. Those have a very specific definition here. We reserve that to talk about vision, hearing, smell, and taste. But yeah, and that ties in great with some of the others. For example, I think Travis, did you have squats or Drew? Drew had squats. The idea that you're using the somatic motor system to send information from the brain to the muscles and telling them to contract so you produce movement. But then you're also getting information back via the somatic sensory system about where your body is in space, how far those tendons and ligaments are stretched, how far the joints are extended, and that kind of thing. Good. Good job, Gia. Thanks for volunteering. And thanks for demonstrating your activity as well. Does anyone else want to demonstrate their activity? Or maybe Sarah, you don't want to touch a hot pan. Jada, you could feel vibrations on a countertop. I guess we could produce vibrations. Yeah, or like when... Really? Oh, that's perfect. Well, tell us about what happened to your hand on the counter or the bench when your phone vibrated.
Table.
Good on somatic sensory. You're receiving information. Now, somatic motor would be information going from where to where. That would be somatic sensory because want to help her out. What would, if Jada felt that vibration, and what's the first thing you do when your phone vibrates, right? You reach for it. What system is activated when she reaches for her phone? I heard mumblings of it. Somatic motor. Yep. Then that, remember, that's information going from your brain to, in this case, the skeletal muscles in your arm that's reaching. Right? Yeah, you could think of it that way. Yep. Good. Good. Sounds like you have a good grasp on this. I will ask a question about this on your ticket out today. So just take a note of which of these activities you had and which category it fell into. Holly, go ahead.
Can you explain the difference between somatic and visceral again? Because I'm like not grasping that.
Absolutely. And that is a perfect segue into the slide that explains the difference between somatic and somatic and visceral. So this slide kind of walks you through the same idea here. And this is a table from your textbook, so you can reference it there. And so let's break this down first into sensory and motor, right? Sensory, remember, is input, afferent input that's going from the outside world to your central nervous system, right? It's information you're receiving. And I want to be clear that when I say outside world, sometimes that also includes what's happening inside your body. So for example, we gave the example of how far your bladder is distended, gives you that sensation of having to urinate, right? And so let's start with somatic sensory. So somatic sensory here, somatic refers to generally information that's coming from the outside world. So that is your senses of pressure, touch, pain, vibration, also proprioception. So that's again, knowing where your body is in space. And all of those things generally associated with the external environment. It also includes two of your special senses, actually three. Your special senses associated with your eyes, which is vision, and special senses associated with your ears, which is, remember, two things, both hearing and your sense of balance or equilibrium. So sensory is always bringing information to the central nervous system. Somatic sensory is generally information from the external environment to the central nervous system. At the same time, we have visceral sensory, which is generally information from inside of your environment to the central nervous system. So things like how far organs are stretched in the case of your digestive organs, your stomach, or potentially your bladder. Internal pain, internal temperature. One of the cues I had for you was that sensation of if you swallow an ice cube, how you can feel that coldness in your belly. It feels very different than if you touch an ice cube with your finger, but you still recognize it as cold. And that is your visceral sensory system there. It also includes things like nausea or hunger, these kind of what we often think of as these kind of urges to do something, right? They're often very nondescript. Like you don't think of the sense of hunger coming necessarily from a place in your body. You kind of associate it with your like belly area, but they're often just kind of these general like feelings and urges, right? Visceral sensory also includes two special senses, and that is your senses of taste and smell, which are closely associated. We talked in a little bit more detail about smell in class on Wednesday, and we have a lab on these special senses. So we'll get into all of these in more detail. So Taryn, going back to your example, remind us what your example was in that first activity? Tasting a strawberry. And what now, given this information, what system is that most relevant there? Visceral sensory, good, and why? Don't overthink it. Okay, let's help her out. Why is tasting a strawberry visceral sensory? I see your hand, Gia, but I'm going to say, Julia, go ahead.
Special visceral sensory in charge of taste.
Yeah, good, exactly. So taste is an example. The special sense of taste falls into the category of visceral sense. Good. And in that case, part of your experience tasting things is also smell. Like if you can't smell and only taste, you lose a lot of the experience of eating food. And I know lots of folks in the past couple of years with COVID or things like that have experienced that. I fortunately was able to avoid having that symptom anyway, which I'm glad for because it would drive me crazy if I couldn't enjoy my food. So that is sensory. Holly, I want to come back to you. Are we answering your question generally? Okay, let's move on and talk about the motor components then. So somatic motor, remember motor signals are going from the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord to muscles and glands. And so generally we associate this with your skeletal muscles, like these voluntary muscles that you're controlling. Visceral motor is associated with smooth muscle and involuntary control. So things, you can think of things like your digestive system, and peristalsis is the kind of primary example of that. Moving that food through your digestive system. We talked about how great it is that you don't have to think about it, and that how weird it would be if you did. After every meal, have to think about, all right, that bolus of food's digested in my stomach, time to move it to my small intestine. To make for like post-dinner conversation to be really boring or exciting, I guess, if you like talking about that kind of thing. Also, this is relevant to things like glands that you're not necessarily thinking about those glands functioning, as well as cardiac muscle. Your heart is regulated. We're going to talk about how the heart's regulated in more detail when we get to the cardiovascular unit. It's actually this really cool combination of the nervous and endocrine systems and a number of factors. But for now, I just want you to know that we can associate it with the visceral motor nervous system. Go ahead, Zoe.
Did you say the somatic systems are more voluntary things and the visceral?
That's a great way to think about it. Yes. Generally speaking, the somatic motor system is going to be voluntary control, primarily of skeletal muscle. And the visceral motor is going to be involuntary control of smooth and cardiac muscle, as well as glands and things like that. Now, there's some kind of exceptions to that, areas where sometimes it's involuntary, sometimes it's voluntary. The best example is breathing. Most of the time, your breathing is involuntary and you're not thinking about it. But if you want, you can control it as well. And so there's some areas that it doesn't neatly fit into either category, but generally that's a great way to think about it. Yeah, good. Thanks, Zoe. Cool. Questions? All right. So what I want to do now is we've talked through the general overall functional divisions and anatomical divisions of the nervous system. I want to get into the nitty gritty, and we're going to talk about the anatomy of the nervous system at a cellular level. So we're going to talk about nervous tissue. Now, remember early in the semester when we had the unit on histology, we talked generally about nervous tissue just a tiny, tiny bit. I want to get into that in a little more depth here. So the first thing you need to know is that there's two main types of cells in nervous tissues, and that these two types of cells are found together. They're intertwined. They work very closely together. And the first is neuron. So generally, when you think about your nervous system, you probably picture a neuron. These are these very specialized cells that conduct electrical impulses. So they're basically circuits. The technical name for this is an action potential. Those of you that have taken 251 with me know that we talk about action potentials in a lot of detail in there. If you've taken 325 with Dr. Panwis, you've probably gotten into action potentials in a lot of detail. For human anatomy, we're not really going to talk about that. It's more of a physiology question. The important thing that I want you to know here is that action potentials is the name for this electrical signal that is transmitted through these neurons. I want to pause here and note that neuron is a kind of cell found in the nervous system. Folks often tend to conflate and mix up or just think that they're the same, a neuron and the nervous tissue. They're not the same. The neuron is a very specific cell type that it is in one type of cell found in the nervous system. So just make sure you're using those words very specifically, neuron and nervous. The second type of nervous tissue is what we generally call support cells. In the central nervous system, we call these neuroglial cells or neuroglia. These are cells that perform a variety of functions in support of your nervous system, but they don't actually transmit those electrical impulses. And in fact, the vast, vast majority, if we counted all the cells in your nervous system, the vast, vast, vast majority of them would be these glial cells, these support cells. A very small percentage of them are the neurons. Now, the neurons tend to get all the flashy credit because they're the ones that are actually conducting those electrical impulses. And it's really important to know, in addition to that, that there's all of these support cells that make that possible. So what I want to do is walk you through the structure of neurons and how they work. And then we're going to walk through some examples of support cells in both the central and peripheral nervous systems. Any questions before we go to the next slide? Cool. So when we talk about neurons, I want to get into the anatomy in a second, but first I want you to know some of the special characteristics of neurons, things that make neurons unique. And just to make a connection to what we covered earlier in class, we talked about those 4 special properties of muscle tissue: excitability, contractibility, et cetera. Now we're kind of talking about the characteristics of the nervous tissue, and specifically here, neurons. The first characteristic is that they are long-lived. Often these cells the same cell will be alive for the entire duration of your life. So that's neat, right? It's not constant turnover, like, for example, epithelial cells. We talked about, for example, stratified squamous epithelial cells in your esophagus are constantly being turned over. You're constantly shedding them and getting new ones. Neurons, not the case. You got a neuron, that's your neuron for a long, long time. They, with very few exceptions, they do not divide. Once you have these neurons, that's it. They're not undergoing mitosis and forming new neurons. And there's a few exceptions. Your neural stem cells early in development are an exception, and a few other places in the central nervous system. And we're actually, for a long time, it was thought to be canon that these cells never divided. Researchers have actually recently learned that there are a few places where they do divide and form new cells. but generally speaking, they're not doing. Go ahead.
Is that why, like, brain damage doesn't like get better? Like this?
Yeah. That's a great question. So Julia's question is about why damage to the brain often doesn't get better or takes a really, really long time to get better. And that's exactly it. So for example, because of something like actual blunt force, if you bop your head hard, or something like a stroke where the tissue's damaged because it doesn't get the blood that it needs, and so it doesn't get oxygen. It can heal over time, but it's very slow to heal. And often the process of healing in that case, like for example, a stroke, isn't about these cells being regenerated, but it's about those neural pathways kind of being reconnected. And so it's a kind of a different kind of healing than simply replacing the tissue. You're essentially rewiring those circuits. I'm thinking about a stroke in particular, where you kind of have to relearn to do certain tasks. And that's exactly why damage to the brain is so important to prevent, I guess I'll say. Yeah. Yeah, great question. Good connection there, Julie. Cool. All right. The last thing I want to talk about with neurons, last special characteristic is they have a very high metabolic rate. They're super demanding. They use a ton of oxygen, and also as an energy substrate, they're important to note that we don't really get into this in this class, but I'll just mention it. They need a lot of glucose as an energy substrate. Other cells in the body can use other molecules to produce ATP. Neurons, by and large, rely on glucose. And so, for example, this is the reason why if you're diabetic and your body's not regulating glucose well, or even if you get like hypoglycemic, the first thing that happens is you feel kind of lightheaded, because it's those neurons that are the first cells to really notice that there's not enough glucose circulating. And so they need a constant supply of blood to deliver both oxygen and glucose to keep themselves going. And they have such a high metabolic demand. If that's not met, you're in deep trouble if those cells are cut off from that supply. So those are the special properties of special characteristics, I'll say, of neurons. I want to talk about what they look like and what their anatomy is at a cellular level. Any questions before I move to this? Yeah, go ahead.
How long does people like able to underwater for like a lot longer than 5 minutes? Then after this starts happening?
Good question. So how can you hold your breath for a long time? Actually, we're going to talk when we get to the respiratory system, we'll talk about breath holding a bit and some of the dangerous ways to get yourself to hold your breath for longer. The answer there is that other aspects of their physiology have kind of changed to allow them to deliver that oxygen and glucose. So it's not the case that those cells don't need that stuff. It is the case that because of different physiological adjustments, higher oxygen capacity, whatever, that the cells are still able to get what they need, even though a person's not breathing. And there's other factors associated with here too, because in that case, then your level of carbon dioxide in your blood really increases, and that actually can cause problems in addition to the lack of oxygen. So yeah, that's a good question. Anything else? Cool. All right, let's look at a neuron. Here's a diagram of a pretty stereotypical neuron. No offense, neuron diagram. This is did I include this one in those slides I provided? You got this. Okay, good. So the first thing I want to point out is just some of the general anatomical structures. The first is the cell body, also known as the soma, also known as the perikaryon. I will generally refer to it as just the cell body, but I want you to know these other terms because you'll see this in your textbook and other places. And this is where we have the bulk of the cytoplasm and the nucleus of the cell. So this is where all the organelles, most of the organelles are. This is where the nucleus is, where proteins are formed, et cetera, et cetera. Then we have two kinds of processes from this cell body. A process, just like in a bone, we talked about a process being an extension of the main part. So for example, if we're looking at a vertebrae, you have that spinous process coming off the back. The same terminology applies here. A process is something coming off that main body. And we have two kinds of processes, dendrites and axons. You can think of these processes as performing two different functional roles. Dendrites are receiving information and delivering it to the cell body. Axons are taking information from that cell body and sending it away. Very simple mnemonic device to remember here, and I'll put this up on the board. Let me make sure we can see it in the screen. There we go. The axon begins with the letter A, and that delivers information away from the cell body, which also starts with the letter A. So axon away. You can see a few other important parts here, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail, but just to introduce you. This part right here is called the axon hillock. This is this kind of conical shaped piece. It looks triangular in 2 dimensions, but remember this is a 3D cell flat in 2 dimensions. And this is that transition between the cell body and the axon here. And the axon hillock is important because this is where that action potential originates, that electrical signal that's transmitted down the axon. We also see a couple important pieces here called the terminal boutons. And actually, let me back up. The terminal arborization. So arborization comes from the word for tree, like Arbor Day is tree day, right? You have these branches that come out at the end of the axon. So the information is transmitted down this axon, and then it kind of splits off into these different little smaller processes called these terminal arborizations, which each end in a structure called a terminal bouton. Bouton is the word for button. I think it's Latin in origin. It's the word for button in French. What's button in Spanish? Does anyone know button in Spanish?
No, looking at, there's, sorry, there's nothing to do, but in Portuguese.
In Portuguese.
It's like, similar, like botão.
Botón. Okay, so the same root. Yeah. So that makes me think it's a Latin root. Anyway, so they have these little, we can't really see in this diagram, but on your notes you can see it. These little kind of button-shaped features on the end. And that's where neurotransmitters are secreted after the electrical impulse travels down. We'll get into that in more detail. I just want to orient you here first. One other thing to notice is that there's these other kinds of cells called Schwann cells. This is an example of a glial cell, and these cells are kind of wrapped around the axon. I'll talk about that in a lot of detail in probably, let's see, probably Monday. But I just want to orient you to what these kind of bluish cylinders wrapped around the axon. So neurons communicate with each other at synapses, and a synapse is a space between a cell. Often here, at least to start, I want to talk about the space between the terminal bouton of one neuron. So here we see the axon of a neuron coming down. There is a little space here, and it secretes neurotransmitters, and those are received by the dendrites of the second neuron. So the synapses between them. Now the synapse is super, super, super tiny. So in this diagram, it looks like they're touching, but they're really not. It's kind of like when my children are messing with each other, and they're like, put their finger in their face, and like, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you. You can think of that the same way with neurons. Basically, they're super, super close, but they're not actually touching. There's a little space there across which those neurotransmitters are secreted. So if we're talking about these neurons in relation to the synapse, we have the presynaptic neuron, the neuron that's sending the signals before the synapse. And then we have the postsynaptic neuron, the neuron that's after the synapse receiving the signals. Now, most synapses are what we call axodendritic, which is what you see here. So axo meaning axon, dendrite or dendritic meaning dendrite. So it's a synapse between the axon of one cell and the dendrites of another cell. But we can, in some cases, have what's called axosomatic synapses. Anybody want to venture to guess what axosomatic might mean? Besides being a great name for a metal band. That's a good one. I'm gonna write that down. Go ahead, Veronica. Super close, right? So it is a connection between the axon of a neuron, and then we have this word stoma. Remember where we saw that word recently? You're on the right track. Yeah, the cell body. So remember that, what do we have here? The cell body is also known as the soma. So it is a synapse that's directly between the axon of the presynaptic neuron and the cell body. So it basically skips the dendrites. Yeah, good. Thanks, Veronica. Now I want to blow up and look at the axodendritic synapse, an example of an axodendritic synapse in a little more detail here. Again, most of this is relevant for your physiology classes. I just want to orient you to the major structures. And so this is this terminal gluton. You can see how it kind of forms this kind of bulbous end at the end of the axon. And what you have here is these vesicles that release neurotransmitters into the synapse. So this synapse or synaptic cleft you see here is the space between the two cells. The electrical signal comes down the axon, tells these little vesicles to dump those neurotransmitters into the space. Those little neurotransmitters float across that tiny space and then are received by receptors in the postsynaptic dendrite. Now, again, we're not going to get into more detail than that, really. I just want you to know the general structure of this at a cellular level, and we'll leave the details for other classes. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I want to show an example. So what I really want to emphasize here with the nervous system, I'm going to skip ahead a few slides. We'll come back to this stuff. And I want to show you this video example that really well illustrates how our nervous system is an electrical system. It really is electricity flowing through these neurons in the exact same way, although at a lower voltage, than the electricity that's traveling through the wires in this building. And because of that, we can interact with our nervous system and even control our nervous system in some interesting ways. So I want to show you this short video clip. It's a short clip from a TED Talk, actually. And it's not, I guess it's not technically human anatomy in the news, but I'd like you to treat this like human anatomy in the news and just know that I can ask you a question about this on your quizzes or exams. So it's about 5 minutes long, and usually, yeah, let me go ahead and play this. There might be an ad before it. I apologize. Honda sponsored our class today. It's great. There we go.
The brain is an amazing and complex portion. While many people are fascinated by the brain, they can't really tell you that much about the properties about how the brain works because we don't teach neuroscience in schools. And one of the reasons why is that the equipment is so complex and so expensive that it's really only done at major universities and large institutions. So in order to be able to access the brain, you really need to, dedicate your life and spend 6.5 years as a graduate to just become a neuroscientist to get access to these tools. And that's a shame because 1 out of 5 of us, that's 20% of the entire world, will have a neurological disorder. And there are 0 cures for these diseases. And so it seems that what we should be doing is sort of reaching back earlier.
All right. So just if anyone's watching this on the recording, and for everyone here, I put a link to this video on the class program for Monday. So you've got access to that as well. Any thoughts, reactions, responses to that? Just curious to know what you thought. It was cool. Why is it cool?
Because it's weird that you don't need your brain to control your body. You need a brain, like your body.
Yeah, and it begs the question, like, does it even have to be a brain? Could it be a computer? And I'm actually going to show you some examples next week in class of some recent technologies that allow people that, for example, are paraplegic from an accident to exhibit some control of those limbs, despite the fact that those neural connections are broken. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Like, we think about our brain and our nervous system and our body being so integrated, but maybe there's ways to kind of mess with that integration. Go ahead, Mark.
Like his arm, like the electrical signals are changing the concentration gradients within like his like neurons that are there, so then it like starts lower in just his arm, basically. Yeah,
that's a great way to put it. You described it really well. So what's happening basically is those electrodes on the outside of his arm are stimulating the electrical impulse that they send, kind of travel through the thin layer of skin there, and they instigate that action potential on this particular, that ulnar nerve. And they are telling it to, they're setting up the instruction for it to tell these skeletal muscles to contract, right? And remember, the muscles that are contracting those fingers are actually the muscles found up here in the arm. And so the signal is really just going a pretty short distance here, sending those action potentials to these muscles here. So in this case, like those flexors we talked about, and should make a connection with lab, like the flexor, let's see, the flexor ulnar radialis is right here. And so that's right there. Yep, that's exactly what's going on. Cool. All right. Well, we've got the video in your program for Monday. Let me see what time we got here. I want to do a few more things and then we'll wrap things up, and I have a short ticket out for you as well. I'm going to just back up. I'm going to talk a little bit more about nervous tissue here, and then we'll pick this up on Monday. So most of the cell bodies of your neurons are located in the central nervous system. It's mostly these axons that extend out of the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. But occasionally they're found in clusters in the peripheral nervous system. And so the takeaway message here is that most often these cell bodies of these neurons are located in these kind of groups together with these axons spreading out and traveling, in some cases, great distances across the body. And we have two different names for what we call these clusters of neuronal cell bodies. If they're in the central nervous system, we call them the nuclei. So for example, the nuclei are these kind of darker areas that you see in this cross-section of the medulla, which is part of your brain. We'll get to that later on, but the important thing to see here is that you can see where these cell bodies are clustered. Now, the vocabulary for that, we call those nuclei, or a single nucleus. This is a good example of a term that I wish we didn't use this way, because it's really confusing, because we already have a nuclei or nucleus in your cells. So just keep this straight. When we talk about a nuclei in the nervous system context, we're generally talking about this group of cell bodies in the central nervous system. If this group of cell bodies is in the peripheral nervous system, we call this a ganglia. So for example, here, this is a cross section of your spinal cord. So this is a transverse section. You're looking down at your spinal cord, and you can see the structure here. And we see some neurons coming up here. We see this bulb right here. This is something called your dorsal root ganglia. This is a collection of those cell bodies of neurons associated with the peripheral. And we're going to look at some microscope slides of this in lab, and you'll also see some nice brain cross sections in lab. We have 2 labs on the nervous system coming up after your practical. Now, neurons are not all the same. In fact, they have a huge variety of different structures. And I'm just going to throw in a teaser right now. I'm just going to show this figure right now, in that they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, depending on where they are and what their function is. And now, all weekend, you can think back and imagine how many cool different types of neurons there are, and know that when you come to class at 8 a.m. on Monday, you'll be able to learn about that. It's like a trailer for class Monday. With that in mind, I'm going to wrap things up with a few announcements and a ticket out. Before I do, what questions do you have about what we covered today? Cool. Note in your class program for Monday, there's a human anatomy in the news. Don't worry about that. I put it in the program. I wasn't sure if we'd get to it today or not. We'll talk about this on Monday. It's about these cells that are active in the brain after death. So a couple of reminders and a ticket out. Remember that lecture quiz number 4 is going to be next week after your lab practical. Again, your lab practical is Tuesday. I want you to spend all of your human anatomy mojo this weekend preparing for that. Oh, just as a detail, I don't have this on my slide. The lab room with all the materials to study is open from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day between now and Monday. It'll be closed Monday after 10 p.m. Actually, it'll be locked Tuesday after 6 a.m. So just know that you'll be able to study through Monday night. It will be locked on Saturday all day because we have ACTs happening here. So there's randos coming into our building, and we want to keep the room secure. If you want to go in and study on Saturday, let me know and I can get you a numeric code for the door there. So just if you're going in Saturday, just shoot me an email and I'll get you a code for that door. Otherwise, remember that Danny has tutoring sessions on now from 4 to 5, and he'll have one on Monday in the lab room. Great preparation for your practical. I have open hours Monday. Note that I had a scheduling conflict from noon to 1, so I just have an hour of open hours Monday. I apologize for that. I had a meeting scheduled at me rather than with me. Nothing I could do about that, but I will be there for an hour on Monday. Finally, there's a ticket out with a couple questions about what we covered in class today. And as promised, your Friday Venn diagram. Have a good weekend, everyone. Shoot me an email if you have any questions as you're studying, of course. And I'll see you Monday.